Sonnet 73 by William Shakespeare. That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long. One of the first things we might notice about Shakespeare's poem is the word choice. We might observe that many of the words have negative connotations in this poem. For example, think about cold and ruined in lines 4 and 5. Fadeth in line 6. And then we have black night and death's second self, kind of creepy language in line 6. In lines 7 and 8, those are 7 and 8. In lines 10, we have ashes. In line 11, deathbed and expire. And in line 12, consumed. The second thing we might notice is that the poem is a monologue. We have a speaker, the me of line 1, but the person being spoken to does not have any lines. That person is an imagined listener. Further, we might observe that the speaker is using all those negative terms mentioned above in reference to himself. We know this because each stanza begins with a reference to the speaker. For example, in me, in line 5. Speaking of stanzas, we should recognize that this little poem is highly structured. As a sonnet, a lyric poem of 14 lines, Shakespeare's audience would have expected a certain structure for the poem, and Shakespeare delivers. Note that the first 12 lines can be divided neatly into 3 stanzas of 4 lines each, and that the last 2 lines form a couplet, a rhymed 2-line pattern that serves as the conclusion or summary for the poem. Another feature of the English or Shakespearean sonnet was that it used a specific rhyme pattern seen in the final syllables of each of the 14 lines. Poets indicate rhyme scheme using letters, so the pattern for this poem and most of Shakespeare's sonnets is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. The rhymes are part of what makes the poem musical. In fact, the word sonnet from the Italian literally means little song. So with those detailed observations out of the way, let's return to the content of the poem to see if we can figure out a message, or at least a theme, that the poet wants the reader to consider. A good way to get at theme is to ask, what do all 3 of these stanzas or paragraphs have in common? The first 4 lines seem to describe a season, one in which there are a few leaves out on the trees and the birds are absent from the tree branches. This seems like the end of autumn and the beginning of winter. The next stanza seems to describe the end of a day, with the light of day slowly fading away until it becomes dark night. Finally, the third stanza pictures a dying fire. We might think of a time we have sat on a beach with friends huddled around a fire. But in Shakespeare's image, the fire has little heat or intensity left, consisting mostly of ashes. So each stanza pictures the end of something, a season, a day, a fire. But what is most important to note is that the speaker draws a comparison between each of these endings and himself. That is, he's not just describing fire to paint a vivid image, he is making a direct connection between his own life and that dying fire. So when we come to the couplet, we find the speaker drawing a lesson or moral from all of these comparisons. The speaker refers to all three images with the pronoun this in line 13. He says, "This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong to love that well which thou must leave ere long." We might paraphrase the speaker's message like this: "You can see, my friend, that I'm old and I'm coming to the end of my life. Since you can clearly see the signs of death approaching for me, you should love me well while I'm still here, because it won't be long before you lose me." So that's one way to interpret the poem. There could be others. As always in poetry, there's lots of things that poets don't tell us that we might wonder about. Why is the speaker about to die? Does he have a disease, or is it simply old age? Who is the listener to this monologue? Is it the speaker's wife or lover? There's no way to tell from the poem. We do know that this poem comes from a collection of sonnets, many of which feature an older man addressing a younger man with whom he seems to be infatuated. Again, this is all speculation. Perhaps a more relevant question to ask for our appreciation of the poem is to think about the universal human experience that Shakespeare describes here. Of course, one might be the experience of losing someone you love. But perhaps it could also apply to non-human aspects of life: a place, a school, a club. Have you ever been part of a group of people, or maybe lived in a city that you really loved, and then you had to leave that group or depart from that place? If so, you should be able to easily identify with the concept of loving something well that you must soon leave. I'll leave you with a couple of questions that are What are some elements of this poem that make you appreciate Shakespeare's skill as a poet? What are ways you might apply this poem to your own experience? I'll read the poem one last time. "That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long."